"You're not really part of this celebration anymore, Helen," my daughter-in-law whispered as she moved my place cart away from the family table on Mother's Day morning, and somehow, hearing those words hurt less than realizing my own son didn't look surprised. I stood there for a moment in the crowded restaurant lobby holding the small gift bag I'd brought for my granddaughter, while Vanessa smiled politely at the hostess as if she hadn't just pushed me out of my own family with a single sentence. "I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end, and let me know what city you're watching from. Because sometimes the people who break your heart live under the same roof as the people you once gave your whole life to." The restaurant smelled like fresh coffee, warm maple syrup, and expensive perfume. Crystal chandeliers reflected soft golden light across the dining room, and everywhere I looked, families were laughing together over oversized brunch platters and glasses of orange juice sparkling like champagne. Mother's Day had always meant something special to me. For more than 30 years, I was the one who hosted it. I cooked the meals. I folded cloth napkins into little roses for the table settings. I remembered everyone's favorite desserts. Even after my husband Arthur passed away 3 years ago, I still tried to hold the family together the only way I knew how. But standing there beside the hostess stand, I suddenly felt like a stranger who had wandered into someone else's celebration. "There must be some mistake," I said quietly, glancing toward the long table near the windows where Daniel and the children were already seated. My grandson Luke was laughing at something on his phone while my granddaughter Sophie sipped pink lemonade through a straw. Not one of them looked toward me. Vanessa adjusted the sleeve of her cream-colored blazer and gave me a smile so polished it barely looked human. "Oh, there's no mistake," she replied softly. "We just wanted immediate family sitting together this year. The hostess can place you at the smaller table near the back." The smaller table, near the hallway leading to the restrooms. My chest tightened, but I kept my expression calm. Years ago, I would have cried. I would have asked Daniel why he was allowing this to happen. But grief changes you. Losing Arthur taught me that some silences speak louder than arguments ever could. I looked toward my son. Daniel finally glanced up from his coffee cup, but only for a second. Then he looked away again. That hurt more than Vanessa's words ever could. The hostess shifted uncomfortably beside me. "Would you still like to be seated, ma'am?" she asked gently. Before I could answer, Sophie suddenly stood from the table holding her phone. "Mom, we're about to take the family picture," she called out. Vanessa turned immediately, her entire face brightening with warmth that disappeared whenever she looked at me. "Perfect timing, sweetheart." I watched as everyone gathered beneath the flower arch near the windows. Daniel wrapped his arm around Vanessa's waist. Luke stood beside his sister. Even little Sophie leaned her head against her father's shoulder. A perfect family portrait. Then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. My photo wasn't on the memory board beside the table. Vanessa had arranged framed family pictures all around the restaurant space for Mother's Day decorations. Wedding photos, vacation pictures, school portraits. There were even old photos of Arthur holding the grandchildren when they were babies. But every single picture that included me had disappeared. I stood there staring at the empty spaces between the frames while laughter echoed across the dining room. And for the first time, I realized this hadn't started today. Vanessa hadn't removed me from one brunch table. She had been quietly removing me from the family itself for years. I drove home with both hands tied around the steering wheel, even though there was almost no traffic on the road that afternoon. The sky above Portland looked pale and heavy, the kind of gray spring day Arthur used to call rain waiting for permission. I kept hearing the clinking of silverware from the restaurant in my head, the laughter, the soft sound of Sophie saying, "We are taking the family picture." Family. Funny how one word can suddenly feel like a locked door. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the tulips near the mailbox were bending in the wind. Arthur planted those tulips 15 years ago because he said every house needed something bright after winter. I sat in the car longer than I should have, staring at the porch light we used to leave on whenever Daniel came home late from college. Back then, this house was full of noise. Football games on Sundays. Burnt pancakes from rushed school mornings. Arthur singing old Frank Sinatra songs while fixing things in the garage. I could still picture Daniel at 17 running through the kitchen grabbing toast before school while I yelled at him to slow down before he choked. Mothers remember those tiny moments forever. Children usually do not. I finally carried my purse inside and closed the front door behind me. The silence hit first. Not dramatic silence. Not movie silence. Just the ordinary quiet of a house where nobody waits for you anymore. My heels clicked softly against the hardwood floors as I walked into the kitchen. I stopped when I saw the Mother's Day card sitting unopened beside the fruit bowl. Sophie must have mailed it earlier that week. A small pink envelope with glittery flowers along the edges. I ran my fingers across her handwriting, but did not open it yet. Somehow I was afraid it might hurt more if the words inside sounded cheerful. The kitchen still looked almost exactly the same as it had the day Arthur died. His coffee mug remained in the cabinet above the stove because I could never bring myself to move it. His reading glasses still sat in the drawer beside the refrigerator. Sometimes grief does not leave all at once. Sometimes it settles quietly into objects and stays there. I loosened my coat and looked toward the dining room. The table was still large enough for 10 people. I used to host Thanksgiving here every year. Daniel would carve the turkey beside Arthur while the children argued over dinner rolls. Vanessa used to compliment my cooking back then. "Nobody makes mashed potatoes like you, Helen," she would say with that polished smile of hers. At the time, I thought she sounded sincere. Now I wondered how long she had been practicing kindness. Like it was part of a performance. I walked over to the family room and noticed the blinking light on the answering machine beside Arthur's old recliner. One new message. I pressed the button slowly. "Hey, Mom, it is me," Daniel's voice said after a pause. He sounded tired. "Careful. I know today was awkward." Vanessa was only trying to simplify things. "Do not take it personally, okay? We will come by sometime this week." The message ended there. No apology. No anger. Somehow that made it worse. I sat down in Arthur's chair and stared at the dark television screen across the room. Simplify things. That was the phrase my son chose after watching his mother get pushed aside on Mother's Day. Outside, rain finally began tapping softly against the windows. And for the first time, I allowed myself to wonder how many family memories had quietly been rewritten while I was still busy trying to preserve them. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise the way I always did after something painful happened. Sleep had become shallow after Arthur died. The smallest worry stayed with me through the night, like quiet guests who refused to leave. I made coffee in the same blue ceramic pot we bought during a road trip through Vermont almost 20 years ago and carried the mug to the kitchen table. Rain still clung to the windows from the night before, leaving faint silver streaks across the glass. For a while, I just sat there listening to the refrigerator hum and the distant sound of traffic waking up somewhere beyond the neighborhood. Then my phone buzzed beside the sugar bowl. A message from Sophie. "Thank you for the necklace, Grandma. Mom says we will visit soon." I smiled faintly at first because I had given Sophie that necklace for her 16th birthday last winter. A delicate silver chain with a tiny pearl pendant that once belonged to my mother. But something about the wording felt strange. "Mom says we will visit soon." Not "I want to see you." Not "I miss you." Children repeat the language they hear around them. I stared at the message longer than I should have before typing back. "I would love that, sweetheart." A few minutes later, another notification appeared. This time from Luke's old tablet. He had forgotten to log out of the family cloud account years ago when Arthur helped him set it up, and occasionally messages still synced onto the spare tablet sitting in my living room bookshelf. Usually I ignored them because it felt intrusive. But that morning the screen lit up before I could look away. "Dad says Grandma cries to make people feel guilty. Mom says she likes attention." My hand froze around the coffee mug. The message came from Luke to one of his friends. Beneath it was a laughing emoji. I read the sentence 3 times because part of me still hoped I had misunderstood it somehow. The kitchen suddenly felt colder. Not because of what Luke wrote. He was 14. Children absorb whatever atmosphere surrounds them. No. What hollowed me out was realizing those words did not belong to him originally. They belonged to adults. To conversations spoken casually behind closed doors. To quiet little comments repeated often enough that eventually a child starts believing them as truth. I slowly set the mug down before my hands could shake hard enough to spill it. Memories started surfacing one after another, small moments I once ignored because I trusted my family too much. Vanessa gently correcting the grandchildren whenever they called me first before asking their mother something. Vanessa joking that I was old-fashioned anytime I shared an opinion at dinner. Vanessa canceling holiday visits at the last minute because the children were overwhelmed. At the time, I told myself families changed as children grew older. I never considered someone might be carefully reshaping my place inside the family itself. Around noon, I drove to the grocery store because sitting alone with my thoughts had started to feel unbearable. The parking lot was crowded with families buying flowers and balloons left over from Mother's Day sales. Inside the store, I passed a display of greeting cards near the entrance. A little girl around 6 years old stood there hugging a pink teddy bear while her father helped her choose a card for her mother. I had to look away. By the time I returned home, another message waited on my phone. This one from Vanessa. Next time, please try not to make things uncomfortable for the children. They notice your moods more than you think. I read it once. Then again, not a single word about my feelings. Not one acknowledgement of what happened at the restaurant. Just another reminder that somehow I had become the problem inside a story I no longer recognized. That evening, I opened the old cedar chest in my bedroom closet for the first time in nearly a year. Arthur used to joke that I stored half my life inside that chest, and perhaps he was right. The scent of aged wood and lavender drifted upward the moment I lifted the lid. Inside were photo albums, handwritten recipes, old birthday cards from Daniel when he was still young enough to draw crooked hearts beside my name. I sat cross-legged on the bedroom floor and carefully opened the thickest photo album onto my lap. Dust floated softly through the late afternoon sunlight pouring across the carpet. The first photograph showed Daniel at 8 years old standing beside Arthur in front of a fishing lake near Bend. Daniel's smile looked so open back then. Trusting. I traced my finger lightly across the faded image before turning the page. There were school concerts, baseball games, Christmas mornings where wrapping paper covered every inch of the living room floor. I noticed something painful as I kept flipping through the years. In every memory, I was behind the camera more than inside the frame. Mothers do that without realizing it. We document everyone else's happiness and slowly disappear from the evidence of our own lives. By the time Vanessa entered the family, I had already spent decades making sure Daniel never felt alone. Arthur worked long hours managing the construction company. So much of the raising fell to me. I packed lunches at 5 in the morning. I sat through piano recitals where Daniel only played 3 songs before quitting 6 months later. I stayed awake beside his bed during fevers. When he struggled during his sophomore year in college, I quietly sold my mother's diamond bracelet to help cover tuition without embarrassing him. I never told him where the money came from. Parents protect their children's pride, even when it costs pieces of their own history. At first, Vanessa seemed charming in the careful way some people learn to be. She brought wine to dinner parties. She complimented my cooking. She called me Mom almost immediately after the wedding. Arthur adored her because she appeared polished and ambitious, and Daniel looked happy beside her. Looking back now, I realized the changes started so gradually that nobody could point to one exact moment. Vanessa never insulted me directly in those early years. Instead, she specialized in small exclusions wrapped in polite language. We thought you might be tired after driving. The children already have plans this weekend. We did not want to bother you. Tiny sentences, softly spoken, easy to dismiss individually. But over time, those moments stacked together like bricks around a door slowly closing. I remembered one Thanksgiving about 7 years ago when I arrived with homemade pies only to discover dinner had already started without me because Vanessa changed the schedule at the last minute. Another Christmas, she arranged matching family pajamas for everyone except me and laughed lightly when she realized there was no extra set. "Oh goodness, I must have forgotten," she said while Daniel stared down at his coffee mug exactly the way he still did now. Arthur noticed some of it near the end. One night after they left our house, he stood quietly at the kitchen sink drying dishes and finally said, "Vanessa likes control more than kindness." At the time, I defended her. I told him families were complicated and younger generations did things differently. Arthur only nodded slowly. "Maybe," he replied. "Or maybe she wants you to feel grateful for crumbs inside a house you built." Sitting there alone in my bedroom years later, I suddenly understood something that made my chest ache in a completely different way. Arthur had seen the truth long before I did. He just died before he could protect me from it. 3 days passed before anyone from the family contacted me again. Not Daniel. Not the children. Only silence. I spent most of those days moving slowly through the house, watering plants that Arthur used to care for, folding laundry that barely needed folding, pretending ordinary routines could still anchor me to something stable. On Thursday afternoon, I was standing in the kitchen slicing apples for a pie when the doorbell rang. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and opened the front door to find Margaret Ellis standing on the porch holding 2 paper cups of coffee from the cafe downtown. Margaret had been my closest friend for over 30 years. She was the kind of woman who noticed things other people missed. Even in college, Arthur used to joke that Margaret could read tension in a room faster than a lawyer reading a contract. She took one look at my face and sighed softly. "I knew something happened," she said as she stepped inside. We sat together in the sunroom overlooking the backyard garden. The roses were beginning to bloom along the fence line, pale pink against the damp green leaves. Margaret stirred cream into her coffee while studying me carefully over the rim of the cup. "Daniel called Richard last week," she finally said. Richard was Margaret's husband, a retired financial advisor who still occasionally consulted for longtime clients. "About refinancing." I frowned slightly. "Refinancing what?" Margaret hesitated just long enough for my stomach to tighten. "Your house." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Outside, wind rustled softly through the trees lining the backyard. I stared at the untouched coffee in my hands. "That does not make any sense," I said quietly. "Daniel knows this house is fully paid off." Margaret nodded slowly. "Exactly." The room suddenly felt smaller, warmer. I thought back to every strange interaction over the past year. Vanessa asking casual questions about property taxes during dinner. Daniel offering to help organize my paperwork after Arthur died. Vanessa repeatedly bringing up retirement communities with indoor pools and security gates as though she were describing vacation resorts instead of places people quietly disappeared into. Margaret leaned forward slightly. "Helen, I do not think this is only about family tension anymore." Her voice remained calm, but there was something underneath it now. Concern. "Richard heard from someone at the bank that Daniel and Vanessa are under serious financial pressure." I blinked slowly. Pressure from what? Bad investments. Credit debt. Something involving a business partnership that collapsed last year. Margaret paused again before adding carefully. "Apparently, they have been trying to free up cash for months." The knife I used for the apples still rested on the kitchen counter behind us. Thin slices had already turned brown from sitting out too long. I stared at them without really seeing them. Suddenly, every memory rearranged itself into something sharper. The Mother's Day humiliation. The disappearing photographs. The comments about me being emotional. The pressure to simplify things. They were not only distancing me emotionally, they were preparing me to surrender space. Property. Control. Margaret reached across the table and touched my hand gently. "I did not want to upset you without being certain," she said. "But when Richard heard Daniel mention your address specifically, I knew you deserved to know." I nodded once, though my chest felt strangely hollow. What hurt most was not the possibility that they needed money. Families struggle sometimes. Arthur and I struggled for years when Daniel was young. No, what hollowed me out was realizing my son had apparently decided manipulation would be easier than honesty. I stood slowly and walked toward the kitchen window overlooking the backyard. Arthur built that garden with his own hands one summer after Daniel graduated high school. I could still picture him out there covered in dirt while the sprinkler soaked his jeans. "Nobody gets this house except you," he told me once while planting the first rose bush. At the time, I thought he meant after death. Standing there now, I realized he may have been warning me about the living instead. The following Monday, I drove downtown just after 8 in the morning while the city still looked half asleep beneath a layer of pale fog. Portland always felt quieter before business hours. Coffee shops opening their doors. Delivery trucks idling beside sidewalks. People hurrying through crosswalks holding paper cups and tired expressions. I parked beside the old brick building where Arthur's attorney still kept his office and sat in the car for a moment staring at my reflection in the windshield. I looked older than I remembered. Not weaker, just tired in a way sleep could not fix. Robert Klein greeted me personally when I stepped into the office lobby. He had handled Arthur's legal work for nearly 20 years and somehow still wore the same charcoal suits and silver cufflinks he wore back then. "Helen," he said warmly, shaking my hand. "I was sorry to hear about the family tension." I smiled faintly. "News travels fast." "Concerns travel faster than news," he replied carefully. That sentence stayed with me as he led me into his office overlooking the river. The room smelled faintly of leather folders and coffee. Large windows let in cold gray light across shelves lined with legal books Arthur once joked nobody actually read anymore. Robert motioned for me to sit while he opened a thick file cabinet beside his desk. You wanted to review the trust documents? He asked. I nodded slowly. And I want to understand exactly what my son thinks he has access to. Robert adjusted his glasses and placed several folders carefully across the desk between us. For the next hour, he walked me through paperwork Arthur had organized years before his death. Property titles, investment accounts, trust protections. Everything was detailed with the kind of precision only Arthur possessed. My husband always believed preparation was a form of love. Halfway through the meeting, Robert paused on one particular document and looked up at me. Did Arthur ever discuss the family protection clause with you? I frowned slightly. I do not believe so. Robert slid the page closer. Your husband added this 2 years before he passed away. I lowered my eyes to the highlighted paragraph. The wording was formal, but the meaning became clear almost immediately. If any beneficiary attempted to pressure, manipulate, or coerce me regarding property transfers, inheritance access could be indefinitely restricted. I looked up slowly. Arthur wrote this? Robert nodded. Personally requested it. For a moment, I could barely breathe. Suddenly, I remembered Arthur sitting quietly at the kitchen counter late at night after Daniel and Vanessa left family dinners. The thoughtful look in his eyes. The way he sometimes asked unusual questions about whether I felt respected. At the time, I assumed he worried too much. Now I realized he had been planning for something I refused to see. There is something else, Robert said carefully. He opened another folder containing several recent account inquiries. Your son contacted our office twice over the last 6 months asking general questions about transferring property ownership after the surviving spouse enters assisted living. I stared at him silently. Did he ever discuss this with you directly? No, I answered quietly. Robert leaned back slightly in his chair. Helen, I am going to speak plainly because Arthur would have wanted that. Your legal position is extremely secure. But I would strongly advise against signing anything your family presents without independent review. Outside the office window, rain drifted softly across the river like smoke. I folded my hands together in my lap and suddenly noticed something strange settling inside me. Not panic, not grief, clarity, the kind that arrives quietly after years of ignoring small warnings. Vanessa thought I was fragile because I still spoke gently. Daniel thought silence meant surrender. Neither of them understood that Arthur spent decades building protections around me long before they ever realized why they might need them. When I finally stood to leave, Robert handed me a slim folder containing copies of the trust documents. Your husband loved you very much, he said softly. I nodded once and held the folder tightly against my chest while walking toward the elevator. For the first time since Mother's Day, I no longer felt confused about what was happening to me. And somehow, that frightened me far less than uncertainty ever did. Over the next 2 weeks, something inside me shifted so quietly that nobody in the family seemed to notice at first. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped sending long, thoughtful messages trying to smooth over tension. I stopped reaching for people who only responded when they needed something. Instead, I watched. And once I started paying attention, the patterns became impossible to ignore. Vanessa suddenly began calling more often than usual. Her voice always sounded overly cheerful now, almost rehearsed. We should all spend more time together, she told me one afternoon while I watered the garden. The children miss you. Yet somehow, those invitations never involved coming to my house anymore. Everything happened at restaurants, at their place, or at carefully planned outings where I always felt slightly out of place. Daniel called twice asking whether I had considered downsizing, since the house must feel lonely after Arthur's death. I noticed he used the same phrases Vanessa used, word for word, as though they had practiced the conversations together beforehand. One Friday evening, they invited me to dinner at their home in Lake Oswego. I accepted because by then I needed to see things clearly with my own eyes. Their house looked beautiful from the outside, but the moment I stepped inside, I sensed tension beneath the polished surfaces. Vanessa hugged me too quickly. Daniel barely made eye contact. Expensive candles burned in the kitchen beside unopened bills stacked carelessly near the fruit bowl. Luke sat silently scrolling through his phone, while Sophie seemed unusually nervous, glancing between her parents during dinner conversations. Halfway through the meal, Vanessa poured herself another glass of wine and smiled toward me across the table. We toured the most wonderful senior living community last week, she said lightly. It honestly felt more like a resort than assisted living. Daniel immediately looked down at his plate. I folded my napkin carefully across my lap. That is interesting, I replied calmly. Vanessa brightened, mistaking politeness for agreement. They have yoga classes, movie nights, transportation services. You would not have to worry about maintaining such a large property anymore. There it was again. Not concern. Strategy. Every conversation slowly circling back toward my house. My independence. My assets. Sophie shifted uncomfortably beside her mother. Grandma likes gardening, she said quietly. Her roses would die if she moved. Vanessa gave a small laugh. Sometimes people have to let go of things that are no longer practical. I noticed Luke watching me carefully from across the table then, almost as if he expected me to react emotionally. Perhaps that was the version of me they discussed privately. Fragile, difficult, lonely enough to pressure. Instead, I smiled softly and asked Sophie about school. The conversation moved on, but the atmosphere never relaxed afterward. As dinner ended, Vanessa walked me toward the front door while Daniel stayed behind clearing dishes. Her voice dropped lower once we were alone in the hallway. We only want what is best for you, Helen, she said gently. You know Daniel worries about managing everything someday. Managing everything. Such an interesting phrase. I met her eyes for several quiet seconds before answering. Your husband is not responsible for my life, Vanessa. Something flickered across her expression then. Not anger exactly. More like irritation that a script had failed. Of course, she replied smoothly. I only meant family should help each other. I nodded once and stepped outside into the cool evening air. As I walked toward my car, I glanced back through the large front window and saw Daniel standing alone in the kitchen with both hands pressed against the counter. He looked exhausted, smaller somehow, and for the first time, I wondered whether my son was fully participating in this plan or simply drowning beside the woman controlling it. The drive home felt strangely peaceful. Rain shimmered softly beneath the streetlights while Arthur's old jazz station played quietly through the speakers. By the time I reached my driveway, I understood something important. Vanessa believed she was slowly cornering an emotional old woman. What she did not realize was that once fear disappears, observation becomes very powerful. 2 nights later, Vanessa called and invited me to another family dinner. This time her tone sounded unusually sweet, almost delicate, the way people speak when they believe they are very close to getting what they want. Daniel really wants us all together, she said warmly. No tension, no stress, just family. I accepted immediately. The silence on the other end of the line lasted half a second too long, as though she had expected resistance. Wonderful, she replied quickly. Saturday at 6. The moment I hung up, I called Robert Klein. By Saturday evening, rain clouds hung low over the city again, turning the streets silver beneath the fading light. I arrived exactly on time, carrying a small lemon cake from the bakery Sophie liked. Vanessa opened the front door wearing a soft beige sweater and an expression polished carefully into kindness. Helen, she said brightly, you look wonderful. I smiled politely and stepped inside. The house smelled like rosemary chicken and expensive candles. Music drifted quietly from hidden speakers somewhere in the living room. Everything looked carefully arranged, almost staged. Daniel greeted me with a tired hug, while Luke barely glanced up from the sofa. Sophie seemed genuinely happy to see me and immediately took the cake box into the kitchen. Grandma still remembers my favorite dessert, she said softly. Vanessa laughed lightly. Of course she does. But her eyes never stopped watching me. Dinner began pleasantly enough. Vanessa complimented my earrings. Daniel asked about the garden. Sophie talked about summer plans. Yet beneath the conversation, I felt tension pulling quietly through the room like a wire stretched too tight. Halfway through dinner, Vanessa finally placed her fork down beside her plate and exchanged a quick glance with Daniel. There it was, the moment they had planned. Helen, Daniel began carefully. Vanessa and I have been thinking a lot about your future. I folded my napkin slowly across my lap. That sounds serious. Vanessa leaned forward gently, her voice smooth and sympathetic. We only want you safe and comfortable. This house is becoming a lot for you to manage alone. Daniel cleared his throat. We found a really beautiful community near the lake. It has medical staff, transportation, social events. I nodded once as though considering it carefully. That is thoughtful. Relief flashed briefly across Vanessa's face before she reached beside her chair and lifted a thin folder onto the table. We actually spoke with a property consultant too, she continued softly. The market is very strong right now. Selling your house could help simplify everything before things become difficult. Simplify. That word again. I noticed Daniel avoiding eye contact completely now. Sophie looked confused. Luke shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Vanessa opened the folder and slid several papers toward me with a pen resting neatly on top. Nothing official tonight, she said lightly. Just preliminary authorization forms so Daniel can help manage things more easily moving forward. I glanced down at the paperwork without touching it. Power of attorney forms. Property transfer discussions. Temporary financial oversight agreements. They moved faster than I expected. Faster than careful people move when acting honestly. For several quiet seconds, nobody spoke. Then I lifted my eyes calmly toward Vanessa. You seem very prepared. Her smile tightened slightly. We are trying to prevent future stress. I nodded slowly and reached into my purse. That makes sense, I said gently. Then I placed my own folder carefully onto the dinner table. The atmosphere changed immediately. Daniel looked confused first. Vanessa looked irritated. Before either of them could speak, the front doorbell rang. Sophie stood halfway from her chair. Are we expecting someone? She asked. I kept my eyes on Vanessa as her expression slowly lost color. Yes, I answered quietly. I invited my attorney. The room fell completely silent except for the soft ticking of the kitchen clock. Daniel stared at me as though seeing me clearly for the first time in years. And Vanessa finally looked afraid. Robert Klein stepped into the dining room carrying a dark leather briefcase, while the entire table sat frozen in silence. Rain tapped softly against the windows behind him, and somewhere in the kitchen, the dishwasher hummed quietly beneath the tension spreading through the house. Vanessa recovered first. Of course she did. She stood immediately with a strained smile stretched across her face. I think there must be some misunderstanding, she said. Lightly. Robert nodded politely while removing his coat. Actually, Mrs. Whitmore invited me personally. Daniel looked pale now. Mom, what is this? He asked quietly. I folded my hands together on the table and looked directly at my son for the first time that evening. Protection, I answered calmly. Sophie stared between us in confusion while Luke slowly lowered his phone onto the table. Robert opened his briefcase and removed several folders with practiced precision. Before any documents are discussed tonight, he said evenly. Mrs. Whitmore requested clarification regarding property rights, estate protections, and recent attempts to obtain financial authority over her affairs. Vanessa's expression hardened almost instantly. Not openly hostile, just cold in a way she usually hid better. Nobody is trying to take advantage of Helen, she replied smoothly. Robert met her gaze without blinking. Then I am sure you will appreciate transparency. He slid several papers across the table toward Daniel first. Your father established a legally protected trust structure before his passing, he explained. The family home, investment accounts, and related assets remain entirely under your mother's sole control unless she voluntarily chooses otherwise. Daniel frowned while reading. I thought eventually the house transferred automatically. Eventually, Robert replied calmly. Not through pressure, coercion, or manipulated consent. Silence swallowed the room. Vanessa's face lost color slowly this time. Robert continued speaking in the same measured tone. Arthur Whitmore included a protection clause specifically designed to suspend inheritance access if any beneficiary attempted to improperly influence Mrs. Whitmore regarding housing, finances, or medical independence. Daniel looked up sharply. Dad did what? I watched my son carefully then. The shock on his face appeared genuine. That mattered more than I expected. Vanessa reached for the documents quickly, scanning the pages with tightening lips. This is ridiculous, she snapped softly. We were trying to help. Robert remained perfectly calm. Then perhaps you can explain why preliminary power of attorney. Forms were prepared before any medical evaluation existed. Nobody answered. Sophie looked horrified now. Luke stared at his parents with the uncomfortable realization that children eventually feel when adult narratives begin collapsing in front of them. Daniel rubbed both hands across his face slowly. Vanessa, you said this was only about simplifying things. She turned toward him immediately. Because it was. But her voice sounded thinner now. Less controlled. Robert quietly placed one final document onto the table. There is another matter, he said. Recent financial inquiries connected to investment losses and outstanding debt obligations. Daniel's head lifted sharply. What debt? Vanessa went completely still. In that moment, I finally understood something painful. My son had known pieces of the truth, but not all of it. She had been managing the panic carefully around him too. Daniel stared at his wife as though seeing someone unfamiliar sitting beside him. Vanessa, he whispered. She stood abruptly from the table. I am not doing this tonight. But nobody stopped her when she walked quickly toward the hallway. The front door opened seconds later, then closed. The house became very quiet afterward. Sophie wiped tears from her cheeks silently while Luke stared down at his folded hands. Daniel remained frozen in his chair long after the sound of Vanessa's car disappeared into the rain outside. Finally, he looked toward me with an expression I had not seen since he was a little boy who realized too late he had broken something important. Mom, he said quietly. I did not know. I believed him. Not completely innocent, but not entirely cruel either. Just weak. Arthur once told me weakness inside a family can damage people almost as deeply as malice. Robert closed his briefcase softly while the kitchen clock ticked above us. And sitting there beneath the warm dining room lights, surrounded by people I once thought I could never lose, I realized something strange. I no longer needed their approval to feel whole again.